just to give a brief update on where we are at in relation to coronavirus and the update. This has obviously been a significant week of changes, with some areas in the country being shifted to a tier kind of 2 or tier 3 level of COVID alert. In Wales, a short lockdown has been introduced. There's not much to say in terms of the specific guidance that government is providing, but there are a number of things I think it would be just helpful, it seems, as perspective for us to have as church leaders. So 4 things I just briefly want to say as we meet the challenge of the coronavirus as it's unfolding. Firstly, I think it's vitally important that as church leaders we be realistic. The reality is that we're facing the prospect of greater restrictions because the virus is increasing. We're seeing that this week, aren't we? The localized restrictions are being introduced, although not yet in England, a national lockdown. In Wales, we've seen the introduction of a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker lockdown, and there's a possibility that such lockdowns will be imposed in England, either on a regional or, less likely, but possibly on a national basis. In Wales, that's included the closure of churches. Government has never promised that it would never close churches again. It has said that it doesn't want to, but if the circumstances for the virus require it to do so, it's clear that government will be willing to do that. It's easy for us as Christians to be massively frustrated by what's happening, and the expectations that we might have had in the summer have to some extent been dashed. But I think it's important for us to be realistic. And as government wrestles with this situation, lots of people have different opinions as to what ought to be done. But the reality is, it seems to be the case that some kind of lockdown is really the only policy option that's available to government at the moment to restrain the virus, to prevent it spreading in the population in a way that ultimately overwhelms the healthcare system. And it's certainly the policy that government is going to pursue. If you want to know what the medical situation is and why coronavirus is being dealt with in this way, can I recommend to you, Peter Saunders gave a really helpful medical summary of the situation in relation to COVID at a sort of a conference held on Monday by Affinity. It's now available on YouTube. It is well worth listening to 15 minutes as Peter, who used to lead CMF, now leads the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, helps us understand what the reality is in relation to COVID and the limited options that are available to governments at this time. So I think we've got to be realistic. Secondly, we need to be prepared. Given that this is the reality that we're facing, we need to be prepared for these circumstances, for greater restrictions that will impact on our ministries, maybe perhaps in some instances to the closing of our churches. And I would suggest that things that therefore as leaders we need to be doing is we need to make sure that I think we're investing in online presence in case churches had to close. It seems to me that over the summer, most of our energies were being invested in how we could reopen physically in the hope that that would become the new norm. The reality is that for the moment, that's probably not going to be the new norm. And therefore, I think it would be wise for us in our planning to be investing in our online presence in case our churches have to close, whether for our services, for our small groups, other activities in church life. And I think at the same time, we need to invest in our online presence to reach people who won't come to church. I think one of the big challenges at the moment is that it seems to me that non-Christians are in the main less likely to come to church in these circumstances with the limitations that are involved. If we want to be reaching people at this particular time, probably an online presence becomes hugely significant. So maybe whereas much of our energy has been focused over the summer period on reopening physically, the reality is we may need to rethink making sure that our online presence is as effective and as widespread as it can possibly be to make the most of the opportunities in the current situation. Thirdly, as we lead our churches, can I urge us we need to be prepared? And I think there are a number of angles to this. It seems to me that in this second wave of the virus, as we are ministering as leaders, we need to be those who are ministering into frustration rather than fear. When the coronavirus first happened, it seemed that people were very fearful, both church people and non-Christians around us. In this current situation, I think the pressure is rather one of frustration rather than a fear in the same way. And the way that we minister, the way that we teach, the way that we counsel and encourage, I think has to recognize that it is often frustration that we are dealing with. That might mean, for example, we've got to be very careful to acknowledge the frustration that people feel, but to make sure that in our ministries we're not exacerbating it. We can actually contribute to stoking the frustration that people are feeling. It's right to acknowledge it, but at one level, there's little we can actually do about the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. Maybe alongside that, we need to sort of encourage a degree of acceptance rather than anger at the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Alongside that, we need to maximize our opportunities for the pastoral support of individuals. The reality is we're going to have to operate within the restrictions that we face, but that means we need to maximize the opportunities that are available for us to provide pastoral support. And I think there are, even under the current restrictions, considerable opportunities available to churches and leaders to provide pastoral support. So in Tier 1, you can still meet 6 people indoors or outdoors. Let's maximize the opportunity to do that. In Tier 2, you can still meet 6 people outdoors. So you can't meet indoors in quite the same way, but there are ways of gathering with up to 6 people outside in gardens or cafes or wherever that has outside seating. Under all tiers, it's still possible to meet for support groups up to 15 in church premises. So people who've got particular needs, struggles, maximize the use of support groups. We can still visit the vulnerable, those who are in need of care and assistance. We need to make the maximum use of phone, FaceTime and Zoom to be keeping up with people. So be planning, how are you going to pastorally care for your people given the limitations, maximize the opportunities that are available there. There's a very helpful guide I spotted this morning on the Baptist Union website for pastoral visits in the light of these restrictions. Really helpful, encouraging us in what we are able to do. And lastly, can I sort of encourage us to be evangelistic in our outlook. I think one of the dangers of the frustrations of these circumstances is we can very easily become inward looking and lose an outward looking focus. So I think we need to be outward looking, not inwardly distracted. The frustration, annoyance with policy, internal debates can take so much of our energy and attention, whereas actually the task of us as churches is to be making disciples, and we need to be looking outwards, not just looking inwards. So that might mean, for example, thinking about how we can meet the particular needs of our community. What ways can we serve? What needs do people have? There are increasing challenges that people are going to be facing. There are going to be people in our communities who lose their jobs, who are in need of support. What are the needs of your community? How could your church think about meeting those? Equipping the members of our church to speak to others. So our prime evangelistic workforce is the members of our church and the conversations they have with neighbours, friends, colleagues, family members. Are we equipping them to be able to speak the gospel well to others in these circumstances? So when there's so much frustration around, when people are talking about COVID issues, are we equipping them to speak of the Lord Jesus and point people to him? And lastly, engage unbelievers with the gospel online. I think in the main, in many contexts, people are not in big numbers going to come to us. Gathering in the church building is not going to be the main place in which we can engage in evangelism. We're going to need to think about how we creatively engage others with the gospel online. So as we meet these challenges, as we face this constantly shifting environment of increasing regulation, can I urge us to sort of do these things, to be realistic about where we find ourselves, to be prepared for the challenge that it presents, to be pastoral and care for our people, making the maximum use of what we're able to do, and then to be evangelistic in our focus.